Hi, thanks for joining me today. My name is Rich Davis. I'm a cybersecurity strategist here at Proofpoint. And today I'd like to talk about something that's a very hot topic at the current time. And that's how we secure a remote workforce in today's rapidly changing conditions. An awful lot has happened over the last 9 months. Organizations have put a lot of time and resource into making sure that the people in our organizations can continue to work and continue to function. But in doing so, have we actually increased the business risk? Have we increased the risk that we'll fall for a cyber attack? That our users might be vulnerable to credential phishing, to impersonation-based attacks, etc. I'd like to cover off today how we can go about measuring and mitigating that potential risk. But before I dive in, I want to just very quickly outline a couple of other points. Firstly, I will be available through this session on the chat to answer your questions. So if you have questions, please do use the chat function to reach out to me at any point. Secondly, we would like to welcome you to visit our stand. If you haven't already done so, please drop by our stand, our booth, where we'll have members of the Proofpoint team available in the chat to interact with you. Also on our booth, we will be running a prize draw. We will be giving away 2 sets of Bose wireless headphones. So if you'd like to enter the prize draw, then please do make a note of the special phrase that I will be talking about later in the event. So keep an eye out for the name of the report that I mention at the end of my talk. Then head over to the booth after the event and ask for the prize draw entry link. Once you get that link, you'll be able to put in that phrase into the link and submit your entry to win one of those 2 sets of Bose headphones. So let's jump right in. But on the face of it, the attackers themselves are really still after 2 things. They're after money, whether that be low-level cybercrime to place ransomware and simply gain through ransomware, right up to nation-state sponsored threat actors who are trying to steal maybe intellectual property to enhance the revenue for the actual the nation itself and the companies within the nation. And then the flip side, of course, is disruption. We still have those entities, those cyber criminals who are there to simply disrupt things, whether it be for the purposes of activism or the like. So I think to really understand the current issue that we face, we need to really look back over the last few years and see how the threat landscape has changed. Now, just 10 years or so ago, we were still focused on spam and how we keep mailboxes clean. But then we went through a phase where the threat actors started to hit the vulnerabilities within the software that we ran, within operating systems, within plugins, within browsers. And we're able to very easily infect endpoints simply by driving people to access a malicious URL. This varied in scale, and this was after stealing financial information as well as personal data. And then, interestingly, a few years ago, we saw a resurgence in a very old tactic, and that was the resurgence in attachments that were macro-driven. The threat actors realized that as these vulnerabilities were being closed off by the vendors, that actually it was easier to trick a person into running their macro and installing malware on their behalf. And we saw this become increasingly widespread with both ransomware-based malware and banking Trojans being rife. But over the last year or two, we've been researching and observing a slight shift in their tactics. While we still see macro and URL-based attacks in their prevalence, we've seen this shift to now trying to trick people into doing things, either giving up their account credentials or breaking into their accounts, or tricking people through impersonation into wiring money where they shouldn't, sending data where they shouldn't. And this is the landscape that we live in now, where actually we've witnessed over 99% of threats. Nearly every single threat that we've seen through 2020 actually doesn't utilize a technical vulnerability. In fact, there's only a couple on this list, and they are Microsoft Office vulnerabilities in 2017. Every other threat tactic that we see relies on the people within our organizations to do something. So what does this look like through the pandemic that we've been facing? Well, we saw three main routes come to prevalence. And the first of these was to create spoof or imposter emails asking for financial transactions, preying on that human error and trying to cash out by simply receiving those funds that were meant for somebody else into the threat actors' accounts. Very simple spoof-based emails, but actually extremely hard to detect and to remediate against. But then we have also been witnessing this slightly newer technique, which is instead of actually just spoofing the individual, even better if you can steal the account of the individual that you want to spoof. Because there's no better way of spoofing than actually using the real account to send a real email to enact that financial transaction. And this is why we've seen such an increase in email account compromise, and why actually the FBI have now lumped in email account compromise with business email compromise in their statistics, in this $26 billion that they now put on in terms of losses over the last few years. And then we've also seen another variant of this where actually, if they gain access, they will actually do multiple things. They may actually exfiltrate some data. Instead of just going down this financial route, they'll actually deploy malware. They'll enact a ransomware attack, copying data out. But because they've also exfiltrated sensitive data, they're now using that as part of the leverage to get them to pay that ransomware demand. So no longer it's just to unlock your data, but it's also to stop the threat actor from leaking the sensitive data that they also have. Again, in effect, trying to cash out. And our threat data really supports this, but it's not just Proofpoint that's saying this. If we look at the Verizon data breach report, then actually stolen credentials are actually at the root of many of the breaches, whether that be through brute force attack or through credential phishing. And in fact, if we look at the next two most common threat types, actually 25% of those involve phishing of some sort. And actually 22% actually then accounts for misdelivery, that human error, especially in the current climate. If we think about how the people within our organizations are working, they're working from home, they're working in a different environment, they're perhaps using new tools. And this chance of actually misdelivering content or leaking content inadvertently has no doubt increased during the current time. So let's have a look at a few real-world examples of some of the new threats that we've seen over the last few months. And we're going to start with collaboration platform phishing. So, as with most attacks, it starts with an email. That email is sent, and it looks like a normal OneDrive notification. It appears to be a publicly shared file with a link to open that document. And sure enough, actually, that does point to OneDrive, because we've observed that OneDrive and SharePoint are actually used in more than 50% of the attacks that we've seen over the last 6 months. It's a great place to store your malware for an attack because it's a trusted site. Actually, in this particular case, it actually redirected the user to sign in. So it pointed to a real document within OneDrive, redirected somebody to sign in, and then from that, they can then take over that account. And if we looked in our backend, in our cloud account compromise product, we were able to actually correlate this with a successful login attempt once those credentials had been stolen through that attack. From there, they're then also able, once they've got access into that account, to actually upload and host malware within that particular account and use that to drive their payloads into other people within that organization and to then attack their business partners. So we were also then able to actually witness this being then shared externally and this malicious content being accessed. So, what does this account takeover problem really look like? Well, it starts with a compromised account. Often, it then leads to files that are being downloaded and modified. Using that to actually create sharing links and share that with contacts. Those contacts then obviously trust the sender. It's coming from the right email address. It's actually being stored on a legitimate platform. So of course, the chances of the recipients clicking that is high. And this just drives this virtuous circle of account takeovers. In fact, we've witnessed that if one account is taken over within an organization, then typically on average, we then see 18 compromised accounts following that, due to their ability to then utilize this account to gain further insight into that organization, further account access within that organization. And it's not just OneDrive lures. We've seen this happen with voicemail-based lures as well. You've got a new voicemail. It points to a SharePoint location, and actually, the file itself is actually a malicious OneNote file. A further example of this is actually to, again, utilize OneDrive that links to a particular phishing mage, a very well-known lure. So what is the scale of this particular problem? Well, in the first half of 2020, when we profiled our threat data, we actually saw 6 million malicious messages that were pointing to SharePoint and OneDrive URLs. We were able to identify just over 5,500 compromised tenants. And when we looked at the statistics around click rates, what was really scary is actually we've got 4 times the chance that somebody will click a malicious SharePoint link. And when it comes to OneDrive, users are actually 10 times more likely to click a malicious OneDrive link than the average link. So not only is it easy to trick somebody into accessing this, but the chances of them then clicking through and deploying the malware or following the threat actor's instructions is extremely high. But if we move on, let's look at a slightly different example, another emerging threat that we've witnessed over the current time. And that again ties into account access of those cloud accounts. And in this case, OAuth token phishing. So for those of you that don't understand the technical aspects of this, you can deploy third-party applications into Office 365 and G Suite that have access into your email, your files, etc., for legitimate, valid purposes. But of course, this can be abused. And this OAuth abuse we've seen rife, where you send an email in, it looks legitimate, and it's trying to gain, trying to persuade people to click a button to access particular content that is being shared. Again, they get taken to their normal login to access this. But to access that content, it's calling a third-party app. And that third-party app requires all sorts of permissions, full read and write permissions to the entire infrastructure in some cases. So by simply clicking through and accepting that app to view that content, you're then actually allowing the threat actor full permission with a token to access your infrastructure. Now, even if the user then changes their password, that token provides them that persistent access into that user account. Now, we've seen further variants of this. There's another example here where actually email is received. It's a folder sharing permission. And when you click on that, it wants you to download and open a Excel form. Nothing unusual about this. I'm sure many of us day in, day out get requests for shared content that will open that sort of form. But again, it actually then redirects to a third-party add-on for Office 365 that wants permissions. And that permission actually allowed them offline access, read access to contacts, to mail, to notes, etc. That provided the level of access that allowed them that persistence to not only exfiltrate data, but also send emails internally to widen their attack scope. So what is this like in terms of the scale of the problem? Going back to the research that we've undertaken, we actually observed that 55% of the tenants that we looked at, that's over 6,000 different tenants in fact, were attacked in this way. In fact, we've discovered over 160 new malicious apps for Office 365 that is overexposing access into those corporate resources. And even some of the legitimate apps actually can pose a risk as well. Amazingly, we actually witnessed over 280 unique applications on a typical tenant. And actually, a third of users within an organization typically have access and have installed at least one third-party app or given permission to at least one third-party app. So this is definitely a growing area of concern that we need to be addressing. Now, on the flip side, if we're thinking about the risks that we've potentially exposed with this new working normal, we also need to think about how we could potentially lose data. And it's very clear if you think about it. Data does not lose itself. Data is where it should be, whether it's on an endpoint, in a cloud repository, or within email. And that data moves to where it shouldn't be through either a negligent user, a user who just doesn't realize that they shouldn't be sharing this in the way they are. A compromised user account that we've already talked about, where actually, with the threat actor having access, they can exfiltrate that data to wherever they want. And then thirdly, this malicious user. That may be a person within your organization who is maybe leaving and wants to take data with them. Or slightly more concerning, maybe an individual who is being paid to exfiltrate data for a threat actor, or even a nation state. So actually, to deal with this, we need to understand where the risk lies, who has access to the sensitive data, so that we can help close off some of these avenues. So let's go back to this first area that I talked about. How do we understand the people-based risk that is represented through inbound threats, firstly, and we'll come back to the outbound issue shortly. So if we really want to understand what that human attack surface looks like, that is the main threat vector for attackers, then we need to think about three distinct areas. And we call this a very attacked person. So who gets targeted by those serious threats that are sophisticated, that are perhaps from a nation state threat actor? That's a very different attack to a PayPal credential phish, for instance, that is just attacking someone's personal PayPal. The business risk of those two threats is very different, and that's why we need to understand the severity of the attack, not just the number or the volume of emails and types of attack that people are facing. Secondly, to really address this, we need to understand who represents the highest level of risk for an organization. Who has access to those critical systems? The sensitive data, maybe they're a member of a design team and has access to the latest intellectual property, the latest designs that are actually really the crown jewel, that core asset for that organization. But then we've also got to consider this third key element. Who is likely to fall for those threats? I'm sure we all know who the clickers are within our organization. I'm sure we all understand who, no matter how much training we offer, will just continually click things, no matter what we do. Now, that's one side of it. That gives us an understanding of who might be vulnerable. But it's also about how people access. Are people accessing from risky devices? Maybe their own devices? Maybe they're accessing from locations that are harder to lock down. Maybe there's somebody that travels a lot and therefore it's harder to spot access from different locations that might be an indicator of a potential account compromise. All of this helps us understand where that risk lies, how to measure the risk and how to mitigate that risk. So looking at our own data for a minute, I wanted to give you just one example of the attack data that we can surface for our customers. Now, this is a global advertising company, and this is their top 20 most attacked people. Now, sure enough, in here, we've got the CEO. That's expected. He's a VIP. But actually, in here, we've also got some very interesting people that may not be at the top of the list. Very, very top entry, for instance, is the PR manager. We've also got a PR director. We've also got a communications officer. So there's a distinct pattern here of people that have access to sensitive data. Now, this advertising firm, as it happens, made lots of acquisitions. So this was a targeted campaign to attack people that have access to that early information around a potential merger or acquisition. Now, also in here, we see that actually a generic information address also features quite high. And that's actually not uncommon because actually that tends to hit many people. Probably less of a concern than some of the other areas that we have highlighted here. And this data is invaluable, not only to understand that it's a severe attack, but what type. So we look at the distribution of attacks, and actually this is mainly stealers, keyloggers, and credential phishing. So blatantly, the threat actors responsible for these types of attacks are going after the account access. They're trying to log access credentials, and they're trying to gain access to that sensitive data that is so key to the financial gain that they're obviously trying to enact here. That's just one example. So to bring this to life, I also want to just very quickly go through a real life example of how this can be used. And for this, I'm actually going to use one of the tools that we have in our portfolio. But everything I've talked about today is really relevant to any organization, whether or not they're using Proofpoint technology. And that's actually understanding the attack profile, the vulnerability, and the privileged access. And all we've done here is actually just bring it together into a view that's very easy to see. So at the very top of this, we can actually think about this in terms of all of the people in an organization. So in this example here, we've got 19,000, just over 19,000 people within the organization. Now, through profiling, understanding the types of attacks they face, we've been able to ascertain that we've got 260 people within this organization who are very attacked. And we can drill down into this list, and we can understand who these targets are, the positions they're in, and we can then drill down further and understand how they're being attacked. Now, you can also then understand whether somebody is very privileged. I'm sure you've all got data that will help you ascertain this, whether it be simply the security group membership in Active Directory, or because you're using a privileged access management, or some sort of platform to manage your user access where you've got this data. So you can understand what privileged access they've got, whether they're an administrator, whether they just have access to sensitive information. And then finally, we can understand whether somebody's vulnerable. We can use data from access logs to understand where they're accessing from. We can look at the clients that they're accessing from and understand whether that increases or decreases the vulnerability. We can correlate that with security awareness training and assessments we might be running, or simulated phish tests, or just the data around the click rates on URLs. And this gives us this ability then to further categorize people. We can understand who are the soft targets, so who is very vulnerable and who is very attacked. Who are the latent targets, so who is vulnerable and privileged but not being attacked right now. Who are the major targets, so who is very attacked and who also has that privileged access. But then we've also got the smoking gun in the middle. Who are our imminent targets? Who are the people that represent the highest level of risk for our organization? And then have the ability to drill down further to understand the detail here. Is there a pattern? Are these all members of a particular team? Interestingly, in this example, all 5 are part of a services team. Now that gives us a clue that this may be a targeted campaign on these individuals, and it gives us the ability to then investigate further. So what do we do with this data? How do we make use of this data? Well, if we think about it, there are a whole series of different recommendations that we can put in place. And actually, we surface these actually in this console, but again, this can be something that can also be done manually by organization. Do you subscribe people to specific training? Do you change processes to limit the risk in a particular area if the attacks are against credential phishing, for instance? Do you then make changes to your process around financial transactions because you're getting people targeted with business email compromise? Do you put in place technology that can help? If a series or group of users that are under heavy attack from, a malware campaign trying to drop a remote access Trojan on people's desktops, maybe they're the desktops that you actually isolate with web isolation. So you can use this to understand and mitigate the people-based risk that you're facing, not only on an individual basis, should I say, but on a global or group basis as well. So, moving on from there, how do we understand the people-based risk from an information protection point of view? How do we understand who might be vulnerable to leak data externally? And for that, we really believe that organizations need to, again, understand some key areas. They need to identify the threat aspect of this. Part of this is identifying who has compromised accounts, who are phished users, i.e., who are the users whose accounts might be compromised. Are these employees? Are they contractors? How do you go about monitoring this? But if we think about it from a traditional DLP point of view, we also need to understand who has access to that sensitive content, who has access to regulated content. But that alone isn't enough. We also need to consider this third aspect, which is the behavioral awareness. What user activity is suspicious? What patterns of access give us an indication that we've got suspicious behavior here as well, that might help us to be able to deploy and observe that people-based risk, that insider threat? So, how do we take all of this data and how do we actually use this to drive risk reduction? Because ultimately, that is all of our overall aims, is to reduce the risk that our organizations face. And by having this view, we can then deploy technology that will help. We can maybe train people in new and innovative ways to help reduce that risk. And of course, there are process changes. And the answer, of course, has to be a combination of all 3 of these. So let's look at this first area of technology. How do we reduce risk with technology? And the first of these key pillars, if we look at how organizations are being attacked, is to make sure that we're deploying an advanced email security solution that is able to detect these impersonation attempts and also be able to detect and prevent credential phishing. Or if they're not able to prevent, actually provide some sort of post-access alerting that will help us remediate that risk. Secondly, we really need to be monitoring that account access, not only for suspicious login behavior, but also malicious behavior, including third-party access to those malicious apps that might have enhanced permissions. But there's another area here that we really need to be focused on, and that's the supply chain risk as well. Very easy for our supply chain to be compromised and for that to be an attack vector. Again, that trusted user to gain access into our organizations. Now, the third key pillar here is actually how we're monitoring those key vectors of how we work. The key exfiltration vectors are, of course, email. They're endpoints still, the ability to copy stuff to USB stick, but also those cloud applications. Whether it be somebody just putting something into an open Azure bucket that provides global access to their data, or putting something in their personal Dropbox to work from home, we need to consider and monitor for this access, not only from an inadvertent, but also from a suspicious behavior perspective. And then lastly, one of the key pillars that we need to consider is how we deploy email authentication to reduce and mitigate that impersonation risk, and how we monitor the risk across our supply chain as well, because we cannot influence whether or not our supply chain are going to have compromised accounts and could be being used to attack our companies. But what we can do is get an understanding as to the level of risk that might be applied based on whether or not that organization are deploying email authentication, whether or not that organization are under attack from email account compromise. Now, of course, the second key area that we need to look at is this people-centric risk reduction aspect. Now, our people shouldn't be our first line of defense, but they very much can be our last line of defense. It is proven that training people has an impact on reducing risk in an organization, not only on the compliance side, but also reducing the likelihood that they will run attackers' code for them, that they will fall for those impersonation or business email compromise attacks, trying to wire money, whether they'll fall for credential phishing and give over their credentials. But we need to do this in a very specific way for it to be effective. Firstly, we need to identify where that risk lies. We need to understand who's being attacked and how they're being attacked. Because for this to be effective, you need to train people on the actual threats that they're facing at the time they're facing them. Once you understand where that risk is and how and who you should be training, we can then deliver training based on those actual threats that changes behavior. It's much more effective to tell somebody, we are training you and your team specifically on this threat because you're facing this threat right now. And in training you, you are helping to reduce the risk this organization faces. That has much more of an effect than just telling the entire organization once a year to do 2 hours of training. But this can only be effective if we then reduce risk and we can measure that we've reduced the risk. Part of that is also empowering our people to report potential threats that will help us reduce the attack surface and report potential data exfiltration avenues. To be able to highlight that perhaps they've witnessed that there is an open AWS bucket, for instance, and that actually they're helping the organization reduce that risk. But of course, for this to be this needs to be really effective, we need to be able to measure and adapt the process. This isn't a one-time exercise. The organizations that we've seen do this in a really effective manner and actually reduce by 75% the chances of a person falling for these types of attacks is one that measures the risk reduction, continually evaluates how they're being attacked, and continually trains users to mitigate the risk of those new attack vectors. It's not unusual to see an organization or a team suddenly be attacked with a technique that they haven't been before. And by constantly measuring this, we can achieve the highest level of effectiveness by training our users. But then finally, we can also reduce the risk through process changes. And there are three key pillars that you should all be considering to reduce your risk here that will tie into potential process changes. First and foremost, very easy way to prevent the business email compromise, the wire transfer attacks, is to always require an out-of-band validation of that transfer. Never just take the email as validation. Put in place a process that requires a instant message validation or voice contact directly with the individual that will help reduce the risk that you will wire money somewhere that you shouldn't. Even if it's with a supply chain partner, because as we've talked about before, if your supply chain is compromised, somebody within the finance team of your supply chain is compromised, they can send an email directly to you. Now, you've got that trust relationship. You can even check the domain and see that it's coming from who it should come from. But unless you validate that via another mechanism, you have no idea whether that's the real person that you're communicating with or not. And this then moves on to this area of actually, how do you put in place communication policies with your business partners and suppliers? There is a lot that can be done by deploying email authentication. So consider whether or not you put in place policies with your key business partners that require them to communicate with you in a particular way, depending on the data that's being transferred. And then I think one of the best things that all organizations can do is to constantly review their access policies. I speak to so many CISOs who have discovered that actually they have over-provisioned privileged access, that there are people who have access to sensitive data that they really don't need. Not only review who has access, but also understand where your sensitive data resides. Have tools that are going to tell you whether or not there's sensitive data in open buckets, whether there's sensitive data sitting in a OneDrive location that's been shared publicly. All of this helps to use process to reduce that risk. So I've talked a lot today about how generally you can understand where your risk lies and talk through some of the potential areas to look at to mitigate that risk once you've got that visibility that you need. And of course, here at Proofpoint, we take that a step further. We've helped many organizations go this next step with our portfolio. And that starts with protecting people from that number one threat vector that is email. We're very, very lucky to have been the leader in the advanced email security space for 7 or 8 years now. We're the number one trusted vendor for email across the Fortune 100, the Fortune 1000, and the Global 2000. And we see more corporate email traffic than any other vendor. And this allows us to help organizations to protect that key threat vector. But secondly, we also have a portfolio that will help users protect themselves through simulated threats that can be sent out, through security awareness training as well as compliance training, to really help mitigate that people-based risk. And then, of course, the third area of our portfolio is this data access issue, protecting the data that people access, whether it be by deploying a DLP solution to look for sensitive data leakage at the endpoint in cloud platforms and through email, whether it's a dedicated insider threat management program for organizations who have the potential for insider threats through contractors, suppliers, or whether they're just dealing with very sensitive intellectual property. Now, to round out our portfolio, we've built a distinct cloud protection platform, utilizing the latest cloud access security broker technology, as well as extending into the web with both web isolation and zero trust access technology. So I hope that's been a useful overview. I did want to, obviously, for those of you who may not be aware that Proofpoint is more than just email, just share that little overview with you as we close out today. So if you've liked what you've heard today, if some of this has resonated with you, then I would like to welcome you to head over to our virtual booth and talk to our team. Our team are on hand to answer any further questions that you've got. And you can also enter the prize draw within the booth. Just ask for the URL link to enter the prize draw. I also would recommend that you read the 2020 State of the Fish report. This is a great resource that gives a real in-depth look into user awareness and vulnerability. Also happens to be the phrase that you'll need to enter the prize draw. So make a note of State of the Fish. Like I say, that's available in our documents section. I would also like to welcome anybody who would like a free assessment to request a free assessment. Now, this assessment will give you that overview and breakdown of who your very attacked people are within your organization. This is a very low-touch assessment, doesn't need any much of your team's time, and does not get in the way of typical flow. It's a hands-off assessment that runs to the side of your typical infrastructure. So, as a final reminder before I close off, please do head over to our stand and use the chat function to interact with our team. Thank you very much for joining today, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.